Hey everyone, so I'm back to do another review, and this time we're talking about John Byrne's Iron Man, which is Iron Man numbers 258 to 277. Now, the last one I did on Iron Man ended at 250, which is the end of the second Michelian Leighton run. And everything from 251 to 257 is pretty much filler. There isn't a lot there, nothing important to mention. And it didn't seem worthy of doing a review just because it's basically just filler arc after filler arc. And this is the next big Iron Man wave to talk about. And there's three main stories here, two big stories, and then just one kind of small payoff story near the end. The first one being Armor Wars 2, and the second one being the Dragon Seed Saga. And then the final one, the kind of inconsequential one, is a Black Widow story called October. It doesn't really have a name, but that's basically what the assumed title is, considering that that's the whole point of the story, and that's what the story is about. It's about a sleeper agent named October. And then it's not really that important. I doubt I'll mention much of anything from it. Now, this is kind of strange to talk about, because I contemplated doing two separate reviews, one for Armor Wars 2 and one for the Dragon Seed Saga. But I didn't have a lot to say about Armor Wars 2, and that's mostly because it's structured in a really strange way. You open up the first issue that John Byrne does, and it's got this big label of Armor Wars 2, and it's this big epic thing, and it's pushed out like it's this big, huge event that it means so much, but it's actually just a setup story. It's a lot better than the original Armor Wars or Stark Wars, but it doesn't really warrant being collected on its own or being pumped out as an event, because it's really just there to lay a lot of groundwork for what's to come in the Dragon Seed Saga. And it shows because the entire story functions as a paralleling relationship between the Mandarin and Tony Stark, and there are issues and issues between the two where you get half of the page is devoted to Tony, and the second half of the page is devoted to the Mandarin, and they're both learning the same things, they're both experiencing the same things, and just because one's good and one's evil, they go in separate directions, but it's very much kind of a co-protagonist thing, and the Mandarin has nothing to do with the so-called Armor Wars, and it just basically feels like a device to get the ball rolling for Tony, and to put him in a certain status quo, so when he takes on the Mandarin, the stakes are a little bit different. Now, I say so-called Armor Wars because Armor Wars is a very strange title for this. The original Armor Wars story was touted up as Armor Wars, the big Iron Man event. When you read other Iron Man issues, they call the story Armor Wars. When you look at all the collected editions, except for the Epic Collection, they call it Armor Wars. But I mentioned in the review that in the actual story, it's called Stark Wars, and the Epic Collection calls it Stark Wars. And I mentioned that Armor Wars is just a better title for it, and Stark Wars is kind of odd. Having read Armor Wars 2, I think Armor Wars is a better title for Stark Wars, and Stark Wars is a better title for Armor Wars 2, because it doesn't really feel like a sequel to Armor Wars, so much as it feels like something... so much as it feels like its own story about Tony's internal struggles. And there isn't a lot of that. Basically what we get in Armor Wars 2 is Tony, after having the chip installed in his back at the end of the Michelian Leighton run, which was kind of a bonehead move on their part, John Byrne decides to kind of pull Tony back to a place where he's at least sort of likable again. And to do that, they say that everything leading up to him finding the chip, all the coincidences were actually planted there, and there's actually this background evil organization that helped manufacture the chip, and they're using it to upload a virus into Tony's nervous system and to kind of break him down from the inside. And So while he's fighting that off, he doesn't have use of his body. And so to compensate for that, he makes this Telepresence Armor, where through his mind he's able to control it and move it around. And then when it gets to the point where these designers of the chip are able to control Tony and his movements, he puts himself inside the suit, and while the signal sent to the chip is forcing him to try and move in different directions, Tony's thoughts are strong enough to allow the suit to force his body to move in the directions he wants it to. But doing so completely wrecks his muscles and his nervous system. And so you see why Stark Warriors might be a little bit of a better title, because it is Tony literally fighting himself. And it helps because now you're able to see Tony as he's paying for all the choices he made up to getting that chip. But there's not a lot of internal character development done with that. There was a little bit here and there of Tony needing instant gratification, and Tony being so much about progress that he neglects the present, but not a lot of that's there. The perfect way to describe both of these arcs is basically that it's a Jack Kirby style, which is weird because it was written from 91 to 92, and it functions as this kind of techno thriller, or basically just techno fantasy, where all you really get is like allusions to small character stuff, but it's more about the spectacle, and it's more about the dynamic appearance of things, and more about the thrill of reading issue to issue, and the twists and stuff like that. And it works better in the first half because it's not overwritten. And the first half also has John Romita Jr. art. And John Romita Jr. did the first Michelinian Leighton run, most of it, not all of it, but most of it. And he comes back here, and his art is just absolutely mind-blowing. It is probably his best work. I hesitate to put it above Daredevil, Man Without Fear, but it's just as good as that. It's right next to that story. It's a really, really beautiful artwork, and regardless of whatever armor he's wearing, Tony, however Tony looks, Romita Jr. is able to make it look incredible. A lot of the times you get stuff like the Heroes Are Born armor or the Hypervelocity armor, and they just look terrible no matter who draws them, but John Romita Jr. is able to make even the most oversized, weird-looking creatures look incredible. And he was a perfect choice for that, and I wish he was able to do the entire run as opposed to just that, because getting him to draw Fing Fang Foom later would have been incredible. But yeah, it's more of a Jack Kirby kind of style, and the issues read extremely quickly. They're very short bursts of dialogue. There's not a lot going on idea-wise, and it's just more about jumping back and forth between the Mandarin and having his actions set up near the end. There's a moment in the beginning that helps kind of put into perspective what Tony did during the first Armor Wars that was never really dealt with in the McLean Leighton run, which is there's an illusion of Titanium Man. And Tony's responsible for killing the Titanium Man, so when he sees him there is kind of a guilt effect there. And they don't do a lot with that, but it helps sort of seed the Stark Wars mentality for most of the run. Now, the real story gets started when you end Armor Wars 2. And Armor Wars 2 ends with Tony having this all-out brawl with the guy that designed the chip. And the big reveal at the end is that he hates Tony Stark, and Tony doesn't know who he is. And it's kind of interestingly done, because both stories and the whole run is about the different layers of power, and who controls what type of power, and the advantages to understanding those power. What's the difference between holding a weapon and channeling inner strength? What's the difference between having means and having intellect? What's the difference between creating opportunity and finding opportunity? And so to have a nameless person challenge Tony to the point of completely breaking Tony down or completely destroying Tony's body is a really good way to hammer into that theme of power. And this actually reads as an interesting companion piece to what John Byrne does with his Superman run, because that run is also in very many ways about the legitimate use of power and who has the authority to use what type of force. And you could probably write up a pretty good treatise on what John Byrne thinks of power and of delegated advantages, just using those 2 runs. But of course, those ideas don't exactly salvage the stories, because you hammer in the theme of power, but the guy that messes with Tony's nervous system never really gets any development outside of that, and that's the big drawback there. Now, in that fight, Rhodey finally overcomes his fear for no good reason, and dons the Iron Man armor, and he's basically going around as Iron Man for the next story arc, while Tony is trying to figure out how to fix his immune system, and every now and then when Rhodey needs his help, he has this exosuit mesh that he uses to move around, but it is causing more and more nerve damage, and finally they get to a place where they meet up with a scientist in China, and the Chinese government allows them to get her help, as long as they help them with their problem. And their problem is the fact that the Mandarin, now armed with Fing Fang Foom, he has taken over a third of China and is demanding control of the rest of it. And in the meantime, Mandarin is also learning from a person that knows the history of the rings, and this is where we get the whole origin of the rings came from an alien race, and the alien dragons that used the rings to pilot their ship, and how Fing Fang Foom is one of them, and the Mandarin's actually learning from another one, and it's basically the Mandarin's rings come from a race of alien dragons, and it's the most Jack Kirby insane out there thing you could do, and it's completely warped to think of the fact that this came out in the 90s. This feels so much like a 60s, 70s kind of story. This feels so much like what the original Stan Lee Iron Man stuff would probably be like, and it's insane to even talk about in the context of the 90s, but whatever, that's what happens. And the Mandarin is also used pretty effectively to that theme of power, because the Mandarin talks quite a bit about inner power and inner strength in this, in that someone with a weapon has not really given themselves an advantage, but rather showed weakness of self, lack of confidence in themselves, and so they become weaker, and so their weapon is now your weapon, and there's a really interesting kind of cognitive dissonance that goes on with the Mandarin, because he uses weapons as well, but he doesn't see himself as being bound by those same laws of power, and so he's got this kind of grandiose ego to himself that he can't have if he's going to be working with these dragons, but then you wonder if the dragons think that all they're trying to do is get rid of his ego so that he's easier to manipulate. So there's a really cool power mind game going on between those two characters, and yet there's still a very good Eastern sense of respect and understanding, and it's extremely well written in that regard. There's even some debates about capitalism versus communism, and that's handled mostly fairly, if not a little bit misguidedly, but still fairly nonetheless. So Tony, Rhodey, and the Mandarin basically join forces by the end of this to fight the dragons. And in the process, the Mandarin loses both of his hands because Tony has to channel his armor's power through the rings to get rid of the dragons, and it's kind of a Deus Ex Machina, but whatever. Again, this is not about the ideas. This is not about the grand character arcs that these people are going on. It's more about the spectacle, and in that way it's able to surpass the second McLean Layton run, because it's not pretending to be anything more than that. Now, the problem we run into here is John Byrne must think he's writing a novel, because he has so many descriptions and so many lines of useless dialogue and useless narrative that don't really add anything to the characters, or add anything to the themes, or add anything to the setting. A lot of the times when you read older comics and you get those narrations that tell you what's going on in the panel, it's kind of there to make sure the story is more simplistic. It's there to make sure you're getting the flow panel to panel. But when you have really dynamic art, there's not really a need for it. So you see with stuff that's drawn by people like Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko, there's a little bit less of that, just simply by the nature of the art able to convey that story a little bit better, and so if the dialogue is there, it's just there to remind you of what to look for in the art. John Byrne doesn't do that. John Byrne has basically poetry lining panel to panel, and it serves no purpose whatsoever, and it's extremely overwritten in that way. And I guarantee you that if you just stopped reading the third person narrations halfway through the Dragon Seed Saga and just read the dialogue, you'd be absolutely fine. There's nothing added to the character development, to the ideas, to the ongoing plot that's in those third person narrations. And I'm a guy that really likes third person narration. To have them be as useless and as distracting as they are here is really a shame, because in the 90s especially, it's sort of a dying art. And the other issue is that every character sounds the same. You get like these, you have these tics, and you have these euphemisms, and you have these basic just idioms, this common dialogue, and every person you ever speak to in your life has a different way of using them, a different style of speech, and sometimes we lose sight of that when we're reading comics or novels or whatever. But with John Byrne, it's really pronounced. Everyone speaks way too properly. Even Rhodey doesn't use his typical slang. Everyone has to speak in like this really strange manner, like as if everyone knows how to use perfect grammar all the time, and it's really distracting because you keep hearing the same phrases come up over and over and over again, and you think, yeah, there's no way that a corporate CEO, a homeless guy, and a Chinese communist, a military leader, and a doctor all speak with these exact same phrases. It's completely preposterous. And then the final thing is just there's a really bad love story thrown into this with the second arc of the doctor that tries to save Tony, doesn't ultimately do it, and Tony's just kind of left there paralyzed. He falls in love with her, and it goes nowhere. There's this idea of you would never want to condemn a woman you love to life with a cripple. I don't think that message actually comes out very well or very maturely. And the fact that he falls in love with her at all is just completely rushed. It's really hard to get into in that way. And one final thing I actually want to mention is Rhodey basically becomes a tech genius here. He's able to keep up with all of the processes and the repairs and the techno jargon that Tony throws at him, and it's kind of strange. It also comes out of nowhere. And so, yeah, this isn't a great run. This isn't even necessarily a good run. It's just about the fun, though. The Dragon Seed Saga and Armor Wars 2 should basically just be read as pleasure reading. They don't do a lot to advance the narrative forward. The big thing they do is they introduce the fact that Tony's chip didn't work, and now his nervous system is shot, and he can't move without using this micro mesh exoskeleton, and using that is actually causing his condition to deteriorate faster. So by the end of this, he only has a few months to live, and he's going to get ready to put all of his affairs in order, and that gets picked up in the Len Kaminsky stuff after this. Aside from that, not a lot happens here. Again, this is just about the fun. The Mandarin is written really well. The Mandarin's a lot of fun to read. The Mandarin's whole scheme is fun. The whole Fin Fang Foom stuff near the end is just absolutely ludicrous, but really, really enjoyable. And that's the big thing about this. If you're just looking to have a fun comic, if you're just kind of tired of all the overly seriousness, all the overdarkness, all the self-seriousness and the lack of subtlety in themes, go ahead and read this just to get a change of pace and to have a little bit of fun. It's not great, but it's perfectly enjoyable. It's a good change of pace from where Nicolini and Layton ended off, and it just made everyone unlikable. And it helps ease you into the Len Kaminsky stuff, which is far superior to the second McLeany Layton run and this. So yeah, I'd recommend checking it out. You can buy it in either the Armor Wars 2 and Dragon Seed Saga trades, or just in the Epic Collection War Games, which collects his whole run as well. It's okay. It's not great. It's okay. Big thing you have to realize is this is not a complicated story. This isn't to Iron Man what John Byrne was to Superman with Man of Steel. This is just okay. Thanks everybody for watching. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree. And I'll see you next time for another review.